So beginning of the 200 series, we're going to be talking about what additional topics do we need in order to really build our automations to set us up for success. So what are those key principles and ideas that we're going to discuss and talk about to set ourselves up for success? We begin the 200 series talking about the big whys. There's a lot of reasons why we want to automate things like saving time, reducing errors, and a whole plethora of other big reasons really why we want to automate. And in the 200 series, we want to talk about the concepts and ideas that we need to keep in mind to be able to maximize the big reasons why, to maximize these big data points like time savings or reducing errors. Because what could end up happening is as we start building things, we start encountering tech debt, right? Just like in real life, debt is not necessarily a good thing to have. Oftentimes, we have to pay back the debt that we owe in a lot of different ways. And when we talk about tech debt, the idea is the same. There is something that we're introducing that we have to pay it back. And when we look at tech debt, oftentimes this comes for a number of different reasons, both, and most of the time, they're unintentional. We don't necessarily want to inject within our automations debt. We don't want to do things that actually take away from our automations, right? It doesn't make sense to build an automation in a way where we actually spend more time trying to figure it out and fix it than the amount of time that it saves us. It defeats the purpose. We don't want to build automations that actually create more errors for us than beforehand, right? This is the idea of going into tech debt within our automations. The things that we do that actually take away from the value of the automations. These are the things that we want to avoid. And we're going to be discussing where do we most commonly see this type of debt occur? What does it look like? And most importantly, what can we do from the get-go so that we can minimize the amount of tech debt that we encounter and idealistically have zero, right? Hit automation financial freedom, if you will. So throughout the 200 series, this is what we're going to focus in on. What are these key principles and ideas that we can apply as we build our automations to be able to maximize the value of them and reduce the amount of debt that we might accidentally introduce in the automations that we build? And so a lot of these concepts, principles, and thoughts come from this idea of clean coding, or what we're going to be calling clean automation or clean principles. If you've signed up for Flow, one of the key speakers there, his name's Uncle Bob. And a lot of what we're talking about in the 200 series is very much inspired and adapted towards automation. So let's first start with these clean automating or clean programming principles. And a lot of these things are very high level, right? When we build automations, much like when we build software, we want to do things like keeping things simple, right? Creating direct and straightforward solutions to try to avoid the complexities that we might encounter. Right? We want to try to minimize that complexity, keep things simple. As we do, we want to build these things in a way that we can maintain, change, and update these things fairly straightforward, fairly easily. When we build things, we want to be able to reuse them so we save time, right? So that we don't have to make the same thing over and over and over again. And to ensure that our automations are resilient, we want to do things like error handling as well as logging. If something does go wrong, we should have a means of mitigating the impact of an error or something unexpected. As we build things, we will eventually come back to them at one point in time. And when we do, we want to build them so that when we look at our automations again, we know what's going on, right? We want to document them and again, build them so that you can look at it and it doesn't take a lot to figure out what's happening. As we build our automations, we want to test them and make sure that they do what we expect them to do, as well as take care of some of those weird edge cases that might occur. And we want to build these things, so again, when people look at them, that it's fairly easy to navigate, fairly easy to use, so that we can continue to grow, continue to scale, continue to improve. And so all of that stuff, most people will agree with. Most people will say, yeah, those are great things. These are things we should do. There's probably very little disagreement in a lot of those key concepts. But the big ideas, though, are, well, how do we do that? What things can we do to build our automations so that we reap all of those things that we just talked about? And this is where the idea of clean programming principles come into play. Right? These are the application points. These are the hows as to how do we get all of those things we just talked about. So let's talk about these clean programming principles, the principles that maximize value and minimize this idea of tech debt. So first principle, and this will be a principle that we're going to see again and again and again. This is known as DRY, or don't repeat yourself. And the idea behind it is it's in its name, right? We want to avoid repetition, and especially unnecessary repetition, to the best of our abilities. There might be instances where we need to repeat ourselves, but we want to seek to reduce the amount of unnecessary repetition. So this idea or this concept of dry, don't repeat yourself. The opposite of dry is wet, both literally as well as a concept. We're going to be seeing examples of wet, again, all throughout the 200 series. This concept, wet, is write everything twice. This is the opposite of dry, again, both literally and as a concept. By being wet, this is where we are unnecessarily over repetitive and over redundant. And by being wet, we actually introduce tech debt and can again take away from a lot of the value that our automations can bring to us. So we're going to eventually investigate 3 different places where we will see this wet versus dry dichotomy. In today's session, just to get kind of a taste, we're going to take a very high level look at 2 places, our workflows and our documentation, and kind of give you some quick application points that you can apply right away when building workflows. So let's hone in and focus on this wet versus dry dichotomy and see how we can change things within our workflows. So this first example here is what we built over in Rewst 104. This is our options generator that's generating a list of groups based off of whether we are adding a user to a group or removing a user to a group. And at the time that we built the automation, while it is simple enough that we could be wet, this is an example of a wet automation, a wet workflow. You'll notice here that in our example, we have this action, list user groups, and this action is being applied in 2 different places, both on the remove side and on the add side. Oftentimes, we end up being wet, more so because of a direct thought or direct translation between how we might think about something as just regular everyday people and translating that directly into the way that we build our automations. And so if I spent more time thinking about how to build this in 104, what we can do is try to reduce the amount of times that we're going to be using this list user groups. Albeit it's only twice, but you can imagine if you're building a larger workflow using the same action over and over again, and if you had to make a change in each one of the copies or instances of that action, but you forget one, you've introduced an error, right? Something that, again, could have been mitigated, could have been prevented if, in our case, or in my case, I just spent a little more time thinking about how to build this workflow. So wet example, one of the downsides is if we need to make a change, we have to make this change in multiple places. If we miss one, we've introduced an error. So in this example, since we're applying this action on both sides, what I can do is, with that in mind, I can implement this just one time and implement it way before that add or remove no op. Knowing that it's going to occur on both sides, I can just retrieve that data either on the add side or on the remove side, reducing the amount of actions that I have here on the screen, trying to make things more clear, trying to reduce the chance of introducing more errors down the line. So in our workflows, applying this wet versus dry dichotomy, what we're looking to do is reduce the amount of times that a single action might be implemented and just kind of think through and see, are there ways that we can just use it once, twice, or again, however many times is actually necessary. So wet versus dry here in the workflows, reducing the amount of actions that we're going to be using. Now, the second place that we're going to be talking about today in regards to this wet versus dry comparison is documentation. Now, first and foremost, before we dive in, I want to caveat and say that we should document, right? So this conversation is not saying don't document, but rather be very strategic and very mindful in regards to how we document. So let's take a look at a wet example of documentation and see how can we make it a little more dry. So the over redundant documentation here is using notes and kind of abusing it. Now, as a caveat to this, oftentimes we need documentation, we need comments, we need notes because there's some sort of gap between how we're building the workflow and how we're thinking about it, right? When we build workflows, we're trying to communicate something very specifically, but again, there might not be all of the language that we need in order to communicate properly. And so this is where comments, notes, etc. comes into play, filling that gap between how do I think about something and then how do I build it. And so in some situations, what might end up happening is we use this notes feature to try to document everything, right? I'll document this action, I'll document these actions, I'll document this portion, I'll document that portion. And just like what we see here, it could take up a lot of space. It could take a lot of effort to try to figure out what note goes with what. And even if we color coded it, it could be a lot of visual stimulation and a lot of visual parsing that we need to do to try to match what goes with what. And again, that takes time, right? And if we're trying to save time, right, it doesn't quite help our cause if we've documented this in a way that it actually takes more time to figure out what's going on than what's actually necessary. So first, again, yes, we do want to use notes. We do want to document our automations, our code, etc. But again, we want to be mindful in how do we approach it and what specifically should we do to try to document efficiently. The first way, and we're going to elaborate a lot more of this in the next course in Rewst 202, but the first way in documentation is being very deliberate, very descriptive, and very strategic in how we decide to name things, right? If we're able to name actions and variables very descriptively, then the name does the speaking for us, right? By having meaningful names, you read the name, and it should give you a very, very good idea of either what the action is doing or what's being contained in the variable. So this is our first line of defense in preventing us from having wet documentation, right? Being mindful, being strategic, and being descriptive in how we document anything, and more specifically, how we name things. The golden rule behind it is we try to name things in a way that's self-documenting, that its name gives us that, again, very, very good idea of either what's being contained in a variable or what the action is doing. So this is our first line of defense, right? Very deliberate naming. Now, sometimes, even with really good naming, there's still a gap. So if you have, for example, 3 actions and you name them very, very descriptively, strategically, etc. But these three actions go, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes it's not very clear what those three actions, what the outcome of those three actions are. I do step 1, I do step 2, I do step 3. I know what each step does, but the outcome, again, might not be so clear, right? So what we can do with the notes in Rewst is document those portions, right? Find a group of actions where the outcome of those actions are not obvious and document those, right? And what can also help with the documentation process is RoboRoosty. You'll see here in the screenshot that there's this little icon of that robot-looking chicken, where when you have a note and you select the options of it, you have that icon, RoboRoosty. RoboRoosty is our AI-powered automation helper, and what it will do for us is create AI-generated documentation based off of everything that we have highlighted in that note section. So it really helps alleviate the documentation writing by just using RoboRoosty. So again, documentation, we do want to document. And one of the best ways to start documenting is by the way we decide to name our actions and the way that we decide to name our variables and our data aliases. By starting there, again, it creates a very easy, natural means of self-documentation so that we don't need to lean into the notes so hard and that we can use notes in a more strategic, deliberate, and more sparse. So that way we have less, but they are, again, emphasized and helps us fill in the gaps that self-documentation and naming conventions might not fill. So why do all of this in the first place? Again, this concept of dry is one of the primary ways that we're going to reduce and possibly eliminate this idea of tech debt, right? By staying dry, it gives us things like clarity and reducing clutter. So that way, when we look at our automations and eventually look at our Jinja code, we are reducing the amount of time that we need to get up to speed to be technically savvy in the automation. And it, again, allows us to maximize the amount of time savings that we get out of an automation that we build. Right. The next one, consistency, right? It helps in regards to making changes. As mentioned, if I have the same thing in multiple places and I need to make a change to each instance or copy of that, I might take a while to do that and I might introduce more errors. And that comes in with maintenance as well. Again, if we stay dry, there's only one or very few places we need to make our changes. So dry is going to be our primary debt buster here in regards to this idea of automation freedom. Speaking of maintenance, the next concept that we're going to be talking about is related to maintenance and is called ETSI, or easy to configure or easy to change. And it's in the name. This concept here is describing the idea of making our automations in a way where we can make changes easily. And the benefit is, again, in its name. If it's easier to change, we save time in making these changes. It makes it so that we don't, it's much harder to introduce new errors, right? So again, maximizing the value of our automations. So let's first talking about what to avoid when we are looking at this idea of easy to configure. Now, all of the concepts that we're going to be talking about from today, tomorrow, and hereafter are things that are going to want to work harmoniously together. So what we want to avoid is leaning into this idea of dry and being so dry at the detriment of the other concepts. So in this example here, I might have taken to heart this idea of dry to try to get rid of a whole bunch of stuff. And I've reduced this workflow down to 3 actions. But looking at this workflow, it it's not so clear that this is the exact same workflow that I built in Rewst 104, right? We don't really know what's happening at a glance with this workflow. And so what we would have to do if I gave you this workflow is to start clicking on stuff and seeing what happens. And sometimes what ends up happening is in the spirit of either being dry or trying to get something to work, we end up hiding things. And so in this example here, one of the things that I hid was the setting of a variable, right? I created this data alias here. I gave it a value and I hid it in this remove transition of this add or remove no op, right? The name of the no op would have given you no indication that I did something like this in the transition, right? There's no hints, there's no notes, there's nothing, right? And this is something that, again, we want to avoid. We want to avoid creating data aliases in what feels like a haphazard or kind of in random places. So we want to avoid hiding these setting of variables. And in the same train of thought, sometimes we might just create variables anywhere, right? Or places that might be semi-related. So for example, we have an action here, list all groups. The action, as it describes, is going to list all the groups. In this case, we see the Microsoft logo. So safe to assume these are the groups coming from Microsoft, like Microsoft Graph. Now, generally speaking, what we want to do here is when we create data aliases or variables for a specific action, the variable should be related to the action itself. So if I'm creating a variable off of this list all groups, the variable that I would expect is the variable that has all the groups. But in this case, what if I did some list comprehension stuff that modified that all groups and created a brand new list of groups that's a subset of all these groups? Again, just based off of this name, list all groups, we may not expect to have a variable that's, again, kind of semi-related or beyond the scope of this action. This is what we want to avoid. So what can we do, right? I still want to stay dry and I still want to do these things, but well, where's the happy median? One thing that we might want to try to do is to document these things with documentation. Again, this is sort of where we see the gap, right? Of trying to document so that we can fill in what we're trying to do. But there's a better way. We can do better here, where we can still be somewhat dry, but also make things easy to configure, finding a balance between these concepts. Before we do, though, I want to kind of talk about some of the tools at our disposal to help us with the easy to configure. One of my favorite buttons when I debug other people's workflows is this data aliases button. It's right next to the lightning bolt, the trigger icon. And what this button does when you click on it is it will show you all of the data aliases, all of the variables contained within the workflow. This is effectively a way of seeing what's going to be in the context or what context variables are available. And you can also see where are these variables being created, where are they being used. It's a very, very useful tool. So again, when I look at other people's workflows, when I help out in Discord, one of the first things that I do is click on this button just to try to get a lay of the land, what variables are here and things like that. So, and tip for you guys, use that button so that way you can see what variables are where. But let's jump back to this example here of this very, very dry workflow. If I wanted to make changes, right, 3 months down the line, 6 months down the line, and I look at this, without clicking on that data aliases button, I have no idea what's here. So we can do better, right? We can make things a little bit better. And the way that we can do that is with the no-op, right? The no-op doesn't do anything, but we can still create variables inside of the no-op within the transition of it. So what we can do is, instead of hiding the setting of variables, we can set the variable in a no-op. And what we'll do with the no-op is we'll give a very descriptive name as to what we're doing in the data alias section. So in this example, it's a set group list, but we can expand it, right, to whatever variable is being set. And then again, just describe what's going on. Be very descriptive in the way that we decide to name our actions as well as our variables. And speaking of creating variables, instead of creating them in actions that, again, might be semi-related or just kind of related, we can create variables where the scope of the variable is beyond the action's functionality in a no-op. So that way, again, same concept, same idea, right? Drop a no-op on your screen, give it a very descriptive name as to what the variable, what is being created in the data alias section, and then name our variable very descriptively. So that while yes, it might not be as dry as the previous example, but at the same time, it gives us these sort of access points right away, right? You can look and see, hey, I'm setting the group list in the no-op over here on the right, and then I'm building the group list over here on the left. So really take advantage of that no-op. Create variables or set variables within the transition of them when the scope of creating or setting that variable goes beyond any specific action that we already have placed down. Let's keep on going here. Let's talk about what other things are available to us to help us with this idea of easy to configure. So the next tool that's in our toolbox with this idea of Etsy are these things called variable configurations. That's what it's known as in the UI. Sometimes you might hear people call them workflow variables. These are simply just variables that we can create that its value is either set or overwritten based off of a trigger. And so this becomes especially useful if within an automation, you have multiple triggers revolving around a specific system type. So for example's sake, let's say we have multiple ticketing systems or PSAs. And for each PSA, you might have a specific value that's associated with that PSA. So if I wanted to sync all of my PSAs or all of my tickets across all of my different PSAs, there might be specific variables that are common amongst all of my ticketing systems, but their values might be different based off of which ticketing system is triggering our automation. So I can create those variables under a section called variable configuration. That's clicking on the pencil, and then you get this section here. It's right above input configuration. Once you've created this variable configuration, over on each individual trigger, you have the ability to set the value that you want for the trigger once it's invoked. So you can have PSA1, and it has specific values that you want set for these variables. PSA2 has different values for these variables, et cetera, et cetera. So just another tool in our tool belt to help us with this easy to configure. All right, next concept, and another one of the heavy hitters in the another one of these heavy hitters that we're going to dive into is automating defensively. Automating defensively is building our automations to defend against errors or unexpected situations, right? These are what we're defending against are things that can cause our workflow to either fail, error out, or not achieve our desired outcome. And so there's only so much that we can do, but the things that we can do, we are going to take care of it on the workflow side. So if our workflow fails, then it's a problem with our workflow. So there's a lot to unpack behind this. So in order to do this, I'm going to head over to Rewst itself. So give me 1 second here. Let me get to a workflow here so we can take a look at this in a little bit more detail. So looking here, opening some stuff up, I'll stop sharing my screen here, and then let's start sharing once again. And here we go. So this is the results of the parent workflow that we built back over in Rewst 106. You'll see that there are a couple of failed and a couple of succeeded. Now, when we talk about if your workflow fails as a workflow problem, let me swing teams over here so I can keep an eye on the chat. What we mean by that is that in an ideal situation, we always want to see the status succeeded. Now, there's a lot of caveats, a lot to talk about, so let's dive in. In a general ideal world, we always want, again, to see succeeded in our status. What that means is we, on our end, did our part to build our workflows in a way where we accounted for errors that could be workflow specific. So an easy example is, let's say I wrote some Jinja, like in some list comprehension, and I didn't account for specific situations, like what if there's nothing for this code to work off of? What if the code encounters this one-off situation and it breaks my whole workflow? That's on me, right? That's my fault that I didn't think about that situation. That's my fault that I didn't code that into my Jinja, right? It's nobody else's fault but my own that I didn't introduce a defense against a situation that could bring my code down. And that's also the same for our workflows as well. What if in an action like this one up here, what if this action fails, right? Even if it's not my fault that the action failed, it is my fault and my problem that I am not considering an on failure like this. I should consider these actions and consider whether or not they succeed or fail. And if they fail, we should do something about it. What that something is going to be dependent on who's building the workflow. But let's circle back. So in an ideal world, we want these statuses to all succeed. And in order to reach that state or that point, as we build our automations, there's two places that we need to be very, very considerate and mindful of. The first one is the actions themselves to ensure that we are accounting for failures. If this action does fail, yes, it might not be our fault that it failed. Maybe the Graph API, or maybe just Microsoft just disappeared. Like a random server out in the middle of who knows where, just power shut down for whatever reason. While that's not our fault, it is our problem, and we have to do something about the failure. So we can build something. It's kind of up to you, right, as to what to build. Right? Maybe it's a simple sort of sub workflow that does something like get error message. So if it fails, right, go grab the error message and then go create a ticket in your PSA. Create ticket. Right. So in the creation of the ticket, you grab the error message and then put it in the description of the ticket that's being created, for example. But we need to account for these errors somehow, or these failures. Otherwise, when they do come, it's going to tank the whole workflow. We're going to get the on failure here, and then we have to do a little bit of digging in the workflow side to figure it out. If we did our due diligence to build something to take care of this, that's sort of the ideal. That's what we're looking for. And that's also the same for our Jinja as well, right? We want to write our code to account for weird edge cases. Like, for example, if we're looking for a user ID, what if we don't get one? right? Something like that. So we should account for these things so that if any of these things, if any failure happens, we have found a way to mitigate it, to surface or bubble it up to whomever needs to know, and we still get these succeeded on our end. And one of the ways that we kind of describe how to do that is with this idea of a finished no-op. And so the finished no-op is sort of an interesting situation that um, finished no-op is an interesting situation that's, well, situational. So let's talk about the idea and the concept first and foremost. So what some people like to do is they put a no-op at the very end of their workflow and they label it finish. And they do it just so that they know specifically where the ending of their workflow is. Now, one interesting aspect of Rewst is that the very last action that executes, if it's if it succeeds, then the rest of the workflow is seen as successful. So again, very interesting sort of paradigm and mechanism to make this work. One of the settings that happens behind the scenes is this task transition criteria sensitivity. So what this defines here is basically saying for every transition that is connected to an action, how many of those transitions have had to successfully transition into this action in order for this action to run. So in this situation here, I have set it up as 2. So let me turn on the annotation here and let's kind of draw out what this stuff here means. So annotate, grab my pen. Let's grab a color that's not red. We'll do yellow. Cool. So we'll see here, okay, thanks teams. We see here in this example right now, I have 5 transitions, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? These 5 are connected with our no-op right here that I've just labeled finish. Okay, since right now the task transition sensitivity is 2, I only need 2 transitions to come in successfully in order for this no-op to execute successfully. So for example, in this situation, what needs to happen is I need to go down both sides of my workflow, right? So that I can go down here and then either action here, let's say this one, and then it succeeds here, and that comes in successfully. This is my 1. And then I have to come down, and then this transition here needs to come in, so this becomes my 2. Since these 2 transitions have transitioned into the no-op, since I specified this number 2, this is satisfied, the no-op will run, and it'll run successfully. Now, let me clear this here really quick. Now, if I change this number from 2 to something bigger, like let's say 5, then what this means is I need 5 transitions to transition into this no-op in order for the no-op to run. So right now I have 5, that's all of them. So I would need every transition to go. And in my case, this is not possible, right? Because here on the graph side, I'm either going to go down this way or this way, right? I can't go down both. And since I can't go down both, let's say I go down the add side, right? I can't go down this side. So then these transitions don't go. And so these are 2 that don't successfully transition. I only have this side here. And same story, I can only pick 1. It's either success or failed. And if it succeeds, right, this is only 1. All of this stuff here still does its thing. This is 2. 2 is less than 5. So since this doesn't meet my criteria sensitivity, this will not run. And then last point here, is this the same thing? Is that by default, the value is set to 0. That's correct. It would not go down both in the example. The way that I built this, it actually will go down both, but you are correct, Leah. If we were to take the example in its purity, it would not go down both. Here, it looks like I ran out of ink on my annotation. So let's try again. Impurity criteria would be 1 then. That is correct in order to make this work. Now we bring all of this up because that's highlights. We bring all of this up because in practice, the default value is 0. So 0, as we see here, means every transition, every task that goes into, in this case, the no-op, needs to have transitioned into the no-op in order for the no-op to run. So as mentioned, the way that we built this, that's not possible. We can't have both on failures and on success transition into a no-op at the same time. So this is one of those big gotchas in Rewst, is if you have multiple things connected into an action, by default, Rewst is looking for all of those transitions that go into a specific action to have executed. So big gotcha in Rewst, something to watch out for in this defensive automation. So again, one more time, task transition criteria sensitivity defines how many transitions need to have transitioned into the action before the action runs. If that number is not met, the action will not run. So in this example here, I have 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by default, the default value is 0, which means every transition connected to the action needs to execute and transition into the action successfully in order for this action or this no-op to work. Since that's not possible, this would not work if by default. So all of that to say, right, is that we need to be very cognizant of how much stuff transitions into an action and make sure that we set these task transition criteria sensitivities appropriately. Okay, so let's jump back to the slides. We'll talk about some couple of other things here so that we can call it good for the day. All right, so we are talking right now about this idea of automating defensively. The idea here is that we want to account for things that could cause our workflow to fail, right? So the two big things are using those on failure transitions to go do something else if an action does not execute the way it's supposed to. And the second place is within our code, our Jinja, accounting for, again, those weird edge cases where things like if we're trying to get a value and it's not there, we need to account for that. And we'll talk more about some of the tools that we have for the coding side in tomorrow's session. So just as a recap, this automation is not defensive because we're not checking for those on failures. And so in an ideal world, defensive automation is pretty straightforward in why we want to do it. We want to make sure that if errors do occur, we account for them. So a couple different ways to do that. Things like input validation, making sure that what comes into our fields and inputs are what we expect. The error handling we just talked about with the on failures. boundary checks so that things don't go beyond what we expect. And then if things do fail, what do we do from there? And so in a simple example here, just having the on failures for our main actions that could fail. All right, last concept that we're going to talk about here is automating securely. This idea here is to protect us against threats, security threats. And a lot of this is basically keeping up with the tried and truths of cybersecurity. Now, what we have on the Rewst end is picking and choosing which users are able to, one, access the platform and anything related to it, and two, once they're in the platform, what do they have access to? So here we have just a simple screenshot of picking and choosing which users are able to come into the platform. And once they are, we assign them roles that define what they can do within the platform itself. And with that, well, there's some other stuff here. We're going to save that for another session. I want to thank you guys for being here and learning Rewst with me. If there's any questions, feel free to stick around. But otherwise, if no questions, I hope you have a great rest of your Monday, and hopefully we'll see you in the next Rewst session.